Hello, kids. Let us continue with holes today. 我们上一次读到 42. Yeah, let's carry on with 43. 43, I looked briefly. It seems to be a longer. Yeah, this is a long chapter. Let's at least do one today. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. 我们不是一直都无家可归的，我记得一个黄色的房间。How old were you when you, Stanley started to ask, but couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know. I must have been real little, because I don't remember too much. I don't remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrists and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me. That one you sang. It was different though. Zero spoke slowly, as if searching his brain for memories and clues. Clues 就是线索. And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I'm pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. It was late afternoon. They were resting in the shades of the thumb. They had spent the morning picking onions and putting them in the sack. It didn't take long, but long enough so that they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave at the first hint of daylight, so they would have plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. 他们就会在旁边等，直到大家睡觉，他们就可以去挖宝藏了。They would dig for as long as it seemed safe, but not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they would head up the dirt road. If it was absolutely safe, they would try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Sneaking in and out, 偷溜进去跟溜出来. Remember, Stanley had warned. The door to the rec room squeaks. Squeak 就是发那种木头门的声音. Now he's laying on his back, trying to save his strength for the long days ahead. He wondered what happened to Zero's parents, but he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might be evicted from their apartment because of the smell of burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they had been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told that he was dead? An image appeared in his head of his parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to recapture the feelings he had had the night before, the inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny. But those feelings didn't return. Inexplicable, 没有办法解释的. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They had dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. 好像是把它们弄湿，所以不会太热. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were right, Stanley said. You had already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on the loose rock. Loose 两个 O 就是松的，很松的。Slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side. 比较陡的那一边。He was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and onions spilled around him. Spill 洒了，倒出来了。水啊，什么东西啊，都可以用这个字。He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. 有刺的藤子。The vine ripped out of the earth, 所以它是连根拔起了。But slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. 他就把一个刺从他的手里面拔出来。Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Retrieve 就是去把它捡回来、收回来、拿回来。Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. 他的裤子的腿，他在裤管上，他也把刺拔出来。The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them. Like styrofoam packing material. 像那些保丽龙白色的那个软软的 packing material， 就是装箱子的时候保护东西不摔破的那个东西。Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They had lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. Recovered, 恢复了，收回来了，捡回来了。When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff. 他们站在一个悬崖的边边 looking down on the dry lake bed. 看着那个干的湖底，海底、湖底都是 lake bed, sea bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. You thirsty? Stanley asked. No, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of challenge between him and Zero. 他们两个好像在比赛谁先喝水哈。They climbed down into the frying pan. Frying pan 就是煎东西的锅子，所以他们可能叫那个沙漠的底叫 frying pan. It was a different spot from when they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another. Eased themselves 就是小心翼翼的往下滑。From one ledge to another. Ledge 就是一个阳台的边边啊，屋子的边边啊，就是那个东西的边边就叫做一个 ledge. And let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. 只有在从 ledge 到 ledge 的时候，他们才小心，其他时间他们就很轻松的往下滑。Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. 太阳越升得越高，他们很熟悉的那个 haze 就是热气跟沙尘的雾就升起来了。You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load. Lighten 就是会变得比较轻，动词，会让你的 load 你的包袱变得比较轻。 I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was just worried about you. Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. 他像一只骆驼一样. They walked for what seemed like a very long time, and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in east and west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. 他的喉咙干到好像被砂纸 sandpaper 就是我们磨木头的那个砂纸，好像被那个东西给 coated 被贴满了，就是包起来了。You sure you sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. 他明明就很渴，但是还是不承认。When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. 他们让那个金属的那个喝水的瓶子最后喝，因为如果要打破了的话，那个是不会打破的。You know I'm not thirsty, Stanley said, as he unscrewed the lid. Unscrew 就是转开那个盖子。I'm drinking just so that you will. I'm drinking so you will, said Zero. They clinked the jars together and, each watching the other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. 他们终于把水倒到他们的很倔强的嘴巴里面 stubborn. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. 可怜的 Zero. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She would tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was very little, I had to wait in small areas, like on a porch step or a doorway. A doorway 就是进门的之前的那一块小地方。Now don't leave here until I get back, she would say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I would hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in a bigger area, like, say, on this block, or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jeffy. Stanley guessed that Jeffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. Hollow 就是空空洞洞的. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I've played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. Lost in thought 就是消失在他自己的记忆当中，在他自己的脑袋里面迷路了，在他自己的脑袋里面迷路了。What? Oh, okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids at a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape, and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked at me. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party. 我不属于那个 party. Even though it was in their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later, a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. But then that same mother told me, "Go away," and she told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got that piece of cake. I ran away so fast, I forgot Jeffy. Did you ever find him, it? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. 好可怜. For a moment, Stanley thought again about his own parents. How awful it would be for them to move. How awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. Abrupt, 突然，很突然的. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right, said Zero. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blacked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. 是一个很受欢迎的一个休息，因为太阳被挡住了。Once again, Zero felt that destiny was on his side. Stanley 觉得命运在他这一边。Zero stopped. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. Make out 就是越来越能够听到了。The faint 很轻微的声音从 camp 传出来。They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. Blend 就是混合起来的，他们可以听到一些混在一起的 indistinct， 分不出来是谁的声音。As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. 当他们越接近的时候，他们偶尔 occasionally 可以听到 Mr. Sir's distinctive 很清楚的 bark 对小孩吼的叫声。They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds traveled in both directions. Aware, 他们是了解的，了解到声音会往两边传的。They approached a cluster of holes. 他们接近 approach 往那个方向 a cluster 就是一堆一群 Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it, then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now, they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon, more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley and his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms. Cradle 就是像抱小孩一样，轻轻这个搂着他的那个袋子 ，instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clanking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound. 突然之间，恐惧涌过了他。When he saw the compound， 当他看到了那个营地 ，compound 就是一堆，就是一个阵地，一个营地。The tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. 恐惧让他觉得头昏。He took a breath, summoned his courage. Summon 就是召唤。呼叫，召唤，收集了他的勇气 and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away. 一个 yard 跟一个公尺是差不多的，大概有50码，一个码 50 yards 一码跟1公尺是差不多的。But Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. 他们爬进去了 adjacent， 就是两个在一起的，一个人在左边，一个人在右边，然后等。Okay, this was a long chapter. Let's stop here and we will continue next time. Okay.